Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kishla Conner. Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kishla Conner. I am a recent graduate and current It's On Us organizer at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Today has been amazing. We've all been inspired by speakers, and we've met and learned from one another. That's because we've all been there. We all care about an issue, and we put a lot of sweat, tears, and long hours organizing our campus. It's rewarding, but sometimes frustrating. But then you have to remember why you're doing it. That classmate who's been sexually assaulted, the brother or sister who's been bullied because they're gay, and the best friend, an immigrant, whose only home has been America but still has to hide in the shadows. You also have to remember you're not alone. There are peers across the country supporting us, and there are leaders showing us the way. And I couldn't think of a better way to leave this incredible summit more energized, more pumped up, than to hear from our next speaker. A man who wears his heart on his sleeve. A man who's always stands up for what is right, and a man who is never afraid to speak his mind. A man also, most importantly, a man who is not just about words, but actions, and getting the job done. Our next speaker has been the center of the most progressive fights in our history and has always been there to show us the way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce you the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please sit down. If you keep that up, I'll start to inhale. You know, flattery is something you should never inhale. Folks, before I begin, the reason I'm a few minutes late, as you've all probably heard, there's been a terrible tragedy that has taken place, occurred earlier today at two military centers in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We don't have all the details, or from that many details. As I'm speaking, I was supposed to be in a meeting with the President of the United States and FBI Director Comey, which I'll be briefed on as I get back. But what we do know is 4 Marines were killed and others were injured. And I don't have much more information at this point, but my heart goes out to their families. And these young Marines were part of your generation that is probably the most incredible generation that this country has seen. Over 4,300,000 since 9/11 signed up and said, "Send me." Almost certain they'd be put in harm's way. And so their families have already given a lot to the country, and now but we will get to the bottom of it, and I ask you to keep their families in your prayers. Well, that was a great introduction. I appreciate it very much. And Kishla, you are working on something that has been a project of mine and near and dear in my heart since I was in undergraduate school, before there was a thing called It's On Us, and before there was an issue of people were willing to face the reality that of the millions of women that were being victimized by social standards and cultural standards that are antiquated and had to be changed. And I want to thank Neera for her leadership of this entire organization, and Ann Johnson for her leadership of GenProgress on everything from student loan reform to It's On Us. It's really great to be back here. And in a sense, if you excuse, we used to say in the Senate, a point of personal privilege, you take me back. You remind me of why I got involved in the first place. It was, I was going to say it wasn't too many years ago, but it was 200 years ago. I sat where you are. I know you've had a full day. You've heard from a lot of great American leaders today, and you've gotten a chance to speak to each other in breakout sessions. And, I basically came to say thank you. You've showed your passion on issues that are the same issues that animated my passion and my concern when I was a kid in Wilmington, Delaware, getting involved in public issues. For me, it started with the civil rights movement, but it moved on from there. And when I got to the Senate as a 29-year-old kid, or I just had turned 30 by the time I got sworn in, the first bill I ever introduced in the Senate was a bill for the student loan program for middle-class guys like me and my sister. Because I remember when we talk about student loans and access to college, we think of it only in terms of the qualified student who will be denied an opportunity. But like a lot of you, I think of it in terms of the mother and father who dream of opportunities for their kids but feel incredibly inadequate because somehow they can't find the resources to get their child to school. I remember when my father went to get a loan for me to get to college. I was a pretty good athlete and had some opportunities, but I still needed money. And my dad, I went down to where he worked and walked in and asked his secretary where he was. He said, "He's outside, honey, on the side of the building." And I walked around to see him, and my dad was pacing back and forth. This is an absolutely true story. And he saw me and looked up. He said, Joey, I'm so sorry." And I thought, God, what happened to my sister, my mother? There's the days before cell phones. Did something happen? I said, "What's the matter, Dad?" He said, "Honey, I went to the bank to try to borrow money to get to school. They wouldn't lend me the money, honey. I'm so ashamed. I'm so ashamed. I'm so sorry." When we don't give a child who's qualified an opportunity, it not only deprives that child of an opportunity, it deprives the parent of the dignity that they're entitled to be accorded. Because there's nothing worse for a parent than looking at their child when they're in need, whether it's sick or otherwise, and know there's nothing they can do to help. So that's the first bill I ever introduced, all the way to It's On Us, and when I wrote the Violence Against Women Act. I don't say that. I'm not saying that for, I hope it doesn't come out the wrong way. I'm not saying that for credit, but I want to remind you of why what you're doing is so important. When I wrote that act, no one was for it. Every women's organization opposed it initially, because they thought it would take the focus off of other issues, from gender equality to women's rights related to reproduction. And I was told there was nothing we could do about it. But I didn't believe that, like you don't believe it. and we persisted. Criminal justice reform. For 17 years, I was chairman or ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. And what you're focusing on was my passion for all those years, from reform to dealing with gun violence, which I've been, in some cases, extremely successful on in the Biden crime bill, which expired under George Bush, to the efforts to rewrite legislation which we've not been able to get passed in this administration. Immigration reform, which is an issue in my first campaign because Chavez was trying to organize farmers into my agricultural state of Delaware the way migrant workers were treated was an abomination. To LGBT rights, which for me, for the past 3 decades, has been the civil rights issue of our generation. And look, ultimately, all this is about making sure that people are afforded the dignity they deserve, and the middle class has an even shot, a level playing field, which they don't have anywhere near now. The deck is stacked against them. I know I'm referred to, and it's almost a joke in Washington, I'm middle class Joe. In Washington, that's not a compliment. It means you're not sophisticated. But I am middle class. The reason I always talk about the middle class and have my whole career is simple. When the middle class does well, the wealthy do very well, and the poor have a way up. That's what it's about. And they're all the things that are animating your passions. It's a very simple proposition. My father used to say, every single person is entitled to be treated with dignity. And the absence of economic opportunity, there's no way to be afforded the dignity people deserve. So I applaud your passion. I really mean this. I applaud your passion. And I urge you to never, ever, ever apologize for it. Never, never, never try to explain it away. Because passion is what ultimately changes circumstances in this country. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is how you translate that passion into real, meaningful progress for the country. It's the only thing I probably know more about than you because I've been hanging around a long time. You know, it takes a lot of moral and political courage. It's about asking what you are willing to lose over as much as what you're willing to fight for. Because I got elected when I was a 29-year-old kid, not old enough to be sworn in the Senate, since that day, everybody who ran for office in Delaware would come to me and say, what's the secret? Because obviously if I won, there had to be a secret that I found out. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. What do I have to know most? I said, you have to look at one thing. And I urge you all to think about this, whether you ever run for office or not. What are you willing to lose over? What is so important to you that you'd rather lose than capitulate? Because if you can't answer that question, you're all in the wrong endeavor. You won't be happy if you have to constantly compromise what you believe because of pressure and interest groups and money. Because here's the truth. No major issue of the day do the American people disagree with any of the things we're fighting for, you and me. Marriage equality, immigration reform, raising the minimum wage, early childhood education, gun violence prevention. I could go on and on. Somewhere between 55 and 90% of the American people agree with what you're fighting for and what we're for on every one of those issues. So it's not a question of convincing the American people we're right on the issues we're for. It's a question of demanding political courage from elected officials to meet the expectations of the American people. Courage they only find if the people, you, demand them to demonstrate it. And you should be proud of how you've already moved this country. You, particularly in this room, but your generation. We had a huge victory on marriage equality last month. It was a horrific battle waged for decades and decades by heroic women and men of the LGBT community, as well as straight people. Some of them risked their lives for the fight by coming out. But your generation, you were the cultural tipping point. You changed the nature of the discussion in America. You altered it. Now there's full-fledged acceptance. It's because of you guys. But we still need you. Because today, while there's freedom to marry in 50 states for marriage to be recognized, in more than half those states, marriage can be recognized, but that very same day you can be fired from your job just because you are LGBT, just because you're you're a lesbian or you're gay, you're transgender. No explanation is required. In 32 states, you're fired. It's outrageous. The reason why it persists, in my view, is because the American people don't know it can be done, even in those states. That's where you guys come in. You have the passion and the energy to bring to the people of those states the knowledge that this can happen. I got roundly criticized for coming out when others didn't. Anyway, coming out on television for marriage equality. No. Here's the point I want to make. Thank you, but I don't, I realize I'm an unusual politician trying to dampen applause, but all kidding aside, guys, I was absolutely certain it was taking no chance. As a matter of fact, I made a bet with some very prominent people you would know if I mentioned their names, that overwhelmingly the American people agreed with me. And they did, because they're decent. So one of the things you can do better than anyone else is give voice to what's happening, because the American people at their core are basically decent. And once you give voice to it, consistently enough, unrelentingly enough, the public will demand of their leaders that they respond. Fighting unemployment discrimination is the next big fight. But just as you made marriage equality the case of your generation, you can make gun violence prevention the case of your generation now. No, you can't. In the so-called Biden crime bill that passed in the early 90s, we made great progress. We eliminated assault weapons, we had extensive background checks, and so on and so forth. But in order to get it done, and by the way, crime dramatically dropped during that period. But what happened? In order for me to get it done, I had to agree that it had to be reauthorized in 10 years, or I couldn't have gotten it passed. 10 years came around and it happened on a Republican watch. The tragedy of Al Gore having lost that election to the Supreme Court was tragic, because it would have been very different the previous 8 years. But it all got wiped out. And then look at, as the president said, in this great country of ours, why are we the only great civilized country where there's carnage after carnage and no response? After 20 children and 6 adults were massacred in Newtown, the president asked me, based on my work back in the 90s, to put together a legislative agenda of sensible gun control that we believe the American people would accept, from banning military-style assault weapons to strengthening background checks to making schools safer, mental health services, and so on. So with a lot of help with a really brilliant staff, I put together a package. We announced it to the American people. We went on the road to sell it. And we sold it, overwhelming to the American people. But Congress, we called on Congress to pass it. It didn't move at all. It didn't move at all. We waged an aggressive effort to make the case to the people, and collectively, we succeeded. 90% of the American people, 85% of households with members of the NRA supported our background check legislation. Let me say that again. 90% of the American people in red states, 85% of the households with an NRA member in it supported rational proposal we put forward in background checks. But those public officials who were asked to step up, for the first time, they didn't have to worry about being outspent because of a guy I like a lot. He's a Republican, but he's first-rate, Michael Bloomberg, and because of two really fine people, Congresswoman Gabby Gifford and Mark Kelly. But combined, it was the first time in a legislative shootout that the NRA was outspent. But we still failed. Why? Well, in my opinion, because of the political influence of extremely powerful groups, not just NRA, but the gun lobby and the manufacturers. Enough elected officials were unwilling to risk their seats based on past examples rather than do what they knew was the right thing to do, and even what their people wanted to do. Folks, I've observed that there's a consistent attribute of human nature that affects the decisions not only of elected officials, but all of us. It's called rationalization. Never underestimate the ability of the human mind to rationalize. I don't know how many members told me, Joe, I can't take the risk because if I lose, you won't have me here to help on food stamps. You won't have me here to help on, because they did other good things. It's called rationalization. And you're all susceptible to it. Everybody is. So, something I urge you to do is first understand and expose those elected officials who are otherwise pretty good people, some of them, who are engaged, no, they are, by the way, who engage in this rationalization, and they'll do it with you. I can't do it in my state because of, there are too many. When I introduced the gun legislation, my state, if I'm not mistaken, had the third highest percentage of gun ownership of any state in the nation. The NRA went at me, hammer and tong and nail, told all the hunters in my state and the duck hunters that I was going to take away their shotguns. But I'm living proof to tell you there's nothing special about me. If you go out and you make the case, and it's common sense, and you stand by your convictions, we can win. And if you now help us make the case on rational gun policy, what it should be, it makes it so much more difficult for elected officials who don't have enough courage sometimes to not rationalize. The same goes with climate change. Environmental awareness is what got my generation involved in public life along with the civil rights movement back in the 70s. It was one of the three issues I ran on: civil rights, ending the war in Vietnam, and the environment, because I come from a corporate state with a lot of smokestacks. But as important as it was to my generation, it's so much more important now. For yours, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Climate change is real. It's as real as gravity. It's real. But why do most Republicans who know that and understand the danger, why do they continue to persist in this fiction? Since day one of this administration, with your insistence The president has carried out the most consequential efforts in history to curb carbon pollution, make our communities more resilient to extreme weather, to develop renewable energy here at home. But again, I think the coordinated city by city, state by state, national attacks on common sense provided by billionaires and multimillionaires and interest groups has been extremely effective. And what happens again? What's the rationale when you spoke to a congressman or a senator you know knows better? You know knows better. Well, they'll say, you know, we can't do that extreme climate legislation because we'll lose jobs here at home. It's going to hurt our economy. It's going to cost ordinary people opportunity, which you know, none of which is true. None of which is true. So you and I, all of us, particularly you, we have to change the calculus. We have to make it impossible for an entire political party to deny climate change as it ravages our cities, our heartlands, our coast. We'll win this fight, but we need to win it sooner than later. Because every month, every year makes a difference. That's why we need you so badly. We need you to keep making the case and demand elected officials confront the truth. Take away their ability to rationalize. Point out to them that more jobs will be created in eliminating the damages of climate change and mitigating them than will be kept by not doing anything about it. Same thing in immigration. We as a nation, we're the nation who we are because we're immigrants. I know that sounds like the usual stuff. I recently had the opportunity to meet with Lee Kuan Yew before he died. If you know anything about him, he was referred to as the Henry Kissinger of the East. He was the president of Singapore, brilliant guy, wrote extensively on the future of India, China, the United States, and Russia. I urge you to read some of his stuff. He recently passed away. I was coming from Mumbai, India, heading to Japan to meet with Abe. And I got a call, would I stop in Singapore and sit down and meet with Lee Kuan Yew? And I was honored to do it. And we were talking about how rapidly Xi has consolidated power in China. And he knows I know Xi better than anybody, only because I spent more time with him than anybody when he was vice president. And so we're talking about how quickly consolidated power. And I said to him, about 5 minutes into what ended up an hour-and-a-half conversation, I said, Mr. President, I said, what are the Chinese doing now? Meaning, what are they contemplating next? And he said, they're in the United States. They're looking for the buried black box. True story. And I looked at him like, you're probably looking at me, but I can't see with the lights. And I said, I smiled and I said, and this was the time that aircraft went down in the ocean there. They couldn't find the black box. And I said, Mr. President, I'm sorry, I'm confused. He said, they're looking for that box that's buried in the United States that contains a secret that allows America to be the only country in the history to be able to constantly be able to remake itself. And I said, well, Mr. President, I'm old enough to presume to give you an answer. They'll find two things in that black box. One is, stamped into the DNA of every naturalized and native-born American is an absolute skepticism for orthodoxy. As bad as our elementary school education or any other education level may be, a child is never criticized for challenging orthodoxy in America. Think about that. Unlike any other country in the world, including Britain, France, anywhere else. That's how we make new things. You break old things. You challenge orthodoxy. And I said the second thing they'll find is they'll find, beginning before the Declaration, an unrelenting stream of immigration, not in trickles, but in great waves throughout the history of our country. And why that's important, Mr. President, is we are able to basically cherry pick the best talent from every culture. And I really mean this. You know, a lot of people think that, you know, people sit around, a bunch of poor folks in Guadalajara sitting around a hand-hewn table in their kitchen, say, you know, I got a great idea. Let's sell everything we have, go to a country that doesn't want us, where we don't speak the language. Won't that be fun? The people who leave to come here are the people with the best imaginations, the greatest amount of courage, the best initiative. That's a fact. That's who we are. So what we're doing is robbing ourselves of the lifeblood of innovation, ingenuity, progress. Blocking immigration reform ignores over 70% of the American people already agree with us. So why isn't it being done? Well, here, there's resistance that's more than one reason. It's not just interest groups. There's a deep-seated antipathy, some of it bordering on hate and racism, that creates stereotypical images about immigrants. All you have to do is listen to the Republican nominating fight right now. I mean it sincerely. Think about it. But folks, at the end of the day, what's thwarting our ability to legislate based on a clear consensus is the increased power and influence of special interest groups, particularly focused on state legislative bodies. If we Democrats have made any mistake, we focus on only the makeup of the Congress, makeup of the Senate. But the Koch brothers can go into Illinois and pick 8, 10 Senate seats, spend $250,000 a seat, which is more than anybody usually raises, spend less than $4 or $5 million, and change the dynamic in the states. We've got to get smarter. All the action isn't only here in the Congress and federally. I could go on, but I won't. Let me ask you a rhetorical question. If you could do only one single thing, only one, to increase fairness, equity, opportunity for the middle class, pass rational gun control, deal with immigration, et cetera, what would it be? I can tell you what one thing I would do. It would be get private money out of political process. The first bill ever introduced that I'm aware of, at least in a generation at the time, was a bill I introduced in 1973, calling for a limitation on how much could be spent in a congressional election, in a Senate election, guaranteeing that challengers would have as much money as the incumbent, and capping it. I ran in 1972 as a middle-class kid who just paid off his college and law school loans with a law firm that was just getting onto its feet. And I was able to run a campaign because I could organize people with $300,000. And I won in a year when Nixon was running, when my opponent was at least twice as well funded as I was, and was a 40-year incumbent who had an 81% favorable rating. Today, I ask myself, if I were in the same exact position, 29 years old in the state of Delaware, a little state, and I wanted to run for the United States Senate with the same ideas and the same ability to organize, could I possibly do it? I would have to raise multiples of $300,000. And per capita, Delaware is one of the most expensive campaigns in the nation because it's the only place where there's no television, and you have to pay for 10 million people, 9 million who, if they voted for you, would be indicted because it's Philadelphia television. So folks, what are we doing? What are we doing? We're cutting off access for so many of you, for so many bright young minds who the only way they can get engaged is you have to go where the money is. And where the money is, there's almost always, implicitly, some string attached. No one buys anybody directly. That doesn't happen. If it does, it's rare. But it's awful hard to take a whole lot of money from a group that you know has a particular position, and then if you conclude they're wrong, vote no. So, ladies and gentlemen, I predict one day the American people are going to wake up and they're going to demand change. Today, it's going to require a constitutional amendment. I introduced the first constitutional amendment on this, limiting dollars, with a guy named Fritz Hollings from South Carolina. So everybody, when I raise it these days, they say, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. So what do we have to do? Whether running for the Senate or Congress or president, well, I can't disarm. I've got to do the same thing. Now, we can argue our interest groups are better than their interest groups. We can argue they're less self-serving than the other teams. That may be all true. But guys, why do you think the middle class thinks things aren't on a level? What chance do you think we have to get the kind of income tax system that I've been fighting for my whole life? What do you think the chances of getting that are? People aren't going to supply money against their own interest. They're not bad people. But I've been pushing to change for my entire career the way we treat unearned income. It's outrageous. It's outrageous. But the people with a whole lot of money are the people with a lot of unearned income, as is defined in the code. Why are they going to give you the money? And folks, we ought to start in our own party. You ought to be demanding of all of us, that at least in our own party fights among ourselves in primaries, that we adhere to a policy that doesn't rest on millionaires and billionaires. They're good people. They're not bad per se. No, I really mean it. But it's a hell of a way to run a democracy. And so the first place you got to start is in the Democratic Party. No matter how much you love me or somebody else, you have to demand of us that we demonstrate we understand. We can do something about the corrosive impact of massive amounts of money. We can demand the people who we support don't yield to millionaires and billionaires. Take their money in limited amounts. But what are we doing? I know a lot of people are going to read into this part of what I'm saying something I'm not intending. I'm not talking about any individual. I really am not. But if we can't even start in our own party, I'm willing to have people start in their own party and say, okay, in the general election, don't disarm and do it there. But in our own party. Look, we can get support, even when we're outspent significantly, and this is not hyperbole, if we have you. We, the party, have you. You, the young, passionate advocates. If I get a chance to go on television with millions of dollars where I'm able to put 2,000 volunteers on the street, I take 2,000 volunteers for real. And so, folks, don't underestimate your ability to influence all of us who are tempted to yield to the temptation to go ahead and do the same thing and, again, rationalize. Rationalize. If I don't, I'm not going to be able to win, and all the good I can do will be gone, even though the way I have to do it is going to, even if it doesn't compromise me, convince average middle-class people that I don't care about them and they therefore will not trust me. You know, we have to speak up. We have to speak up. I know a lot of what I just said probably sounds Pollyannish to you, but I've been around longer than all these other guys. I'm telling you, it can be done. It always is done by generations like yours. I'll end by taking you back. In 1972, as a 29-year-old kid, the war in Vietnam was raging. The women's movement was you're criticized if you raised the issue. The environmental movement was, and everybody, the chant in the late 60s when I was in law school is drop out. Politics was viewed as dirty and corrupt and corrupting. So the temptation of that generation to drop out was no less than the temptation of your generation to say, be damned with it. It's not worth it. It can't happen. But a whole bunch of us disagreed. And we changed things. We ended a war. We completed the civil rights movement as it was pictured at the time. We generated the genuine beginning of the women's movement and the environmental movement. Not me, my generation. But if you go back and look at what the odds were, they were slim to none. So the only message I want to leave you with is this. You have the talent, the intellect, the passion, and the commitment. I don't want you to get discouraged. I don't want you to get discouraged. I promise you. If you keep doing what you're doing, if you generate and increase your numbers, if you never apologize for your passion, if you always gird yourself against the temptation to rationalize, if you're actually willing to listen to the other side to generate a consensus, this can all get done. Ultimately, that's the only way we can make progress in this country. How can we govern the most heterogeneous democracy in the world, the history of the world, without generating consensus? You've already made a great deal of difference in the lives of the American people, and that's not hyperbole. You already have. You, people in this room, already have. There's even more reason now to be idealistic and optimistic and tenacious and passionate and principled than any time. Think of it this way, folks, and I'll get out of your hair. If you're ever going to be involved in public affairs, in whatever fora, this is the time to do it. Because things are changing. They're changing. They're going to change. No matter what you do, the question is how they change. There's very few periods in American history. I call them inflection points. I remember my physics professor defining what an inflection point was. He gave us a metaphor. He said it's like driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour, both hands on the wheel, and you abruptly turn it 10 degrees to the right or left. You can never get back on the path you were on. Well, that's what's happened. Not because of Barack Obama and Joe Biden or anyone else. Because these are moments of great change. William Butler Yeats, in a poem he wrote called Easter Sunday, 1916, talks about the first rising in Ireland in the 20th century. And he wrote a line, he said, "All's changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty has been born." Well, that description is more apt to today in world and national politics than it was then. All has changed in the last 15 years. But if we have our hands on the wheel, we have, unlike in periods of status quo, we have a chance to bend history just a little bit. Just a little bit. But it's only going to be done by you. It's only, I mean this sincerely, it's only going to be done by young, decent, passionate people of principle. That's how all change has taken place in America. So let me conclude by saying I came to thank you and tell you we badly, badly, badly need you. So don't get despondent. Don't disengage. Disrupt the status quo. Make noise. Take everybody on. And don't ever settle for it can't be done. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thanks.